Hello, my name is Tim Jones. I found this crusty old book at a garage sale a couple of years ago and purchased it for a couple of bucks. What first caught my interest was the title and then the hundreds of old photographs of Cuba. Now, the book was printed in 1898 and it said its purpose was to educate the average American family about our newest possession, Cuba. Now, I found this kind of funny because I didn't really remember from my American history class that we, the United States, owned Cuba. The book also goes on to describe not only the occupation of Cuba by U.S. forces, but the destruction of the battleship Maine. The explosion on the Maine resulted in the deaths of at least 268 American sailors. It was blamed on Spain. The United States declared war on Spain, and after a brief war, took possession of the island of Cuba. And this really got me thinking, what had happened that has led to our current relationship, or more correctly, lack of relationship with Cuba today? And to really find out, I think I need to head to Cuba to try to find out. By the middle of the 16th century, Spanish conquests in the Americas resulted in tremendous amounts of silver and gold being extracted and sent to Europe. The Americas, at a devastating cost, became an important source of everything from sugar, tobacco, coffee, and a myriad of other products. Cuba was of particular importance because of its location at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, and Havana became a critical, well-fortified port city. Later, in the newly formed but still puny United States, President Monroe warned the European powers against interfering in potential United States territories and expressed the U.S. interest in controlling the Western Hemisphere. Over time, this policy grew to include the right of the United States to intervene and control the affairs of neighboring countries. Early on, the United States had an interest in the islands of Puerto Rico and Cuba. In 1825, John Quincy Adams proclaimed they were natural appendages of the North American continent and that Cuba was of paramount importance. Numerous offers by the United States to purchase Cuba were rejected by Spain. Over time, Cuban resistance to Spanish control grew, and Spain's increasingly harsh response provided an opening for the United States to intervene. In 1898, amid low-level tension with Spain, the United States sent the battleship Maine to visit Havana. The purpose of the visit was largely friendly, but the hidden objective was to support the Cuban rebellion. On February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine exploded and sank just over there in Havana Harbor. About 268 American sailors were killed, and Spain got the blame. After a brief war, the United States took possession of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii, and the Philippines. Cuba largely expected to be independent, but it didn't turn out that way. The invading American forces set up a military government, and later a constitution was established that contained an important provision of a treaty that was called the Platt Amendment that gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, prohibited Cuba from assuming any debts, and also gave the United States what was essentially a permanent lease of 45 square miles of land and water at Guantanamo Bay. U.S. investors were given a free hand on the island. The major industry continued to be the highly profitable sugar, and by the 1920s, U.S. companies controlled 2/3 of Cuban agriculture. Little investment was made in Cuba, education, healthcare, or anything else. Needless to say, things didn't go well. Between 1898 and 1922, the United States military occupied Cuba at least 4 times. The stated reason was to protect American interests. Add in years of U.S. meddling, indifference, poverty, control by dictators, and a successful revolution led by Fidel Castro. And, worst of all, a refusal to pay American businesses for their, quote, losses in Cuba. And you have the makings of a modern American economic embargo. Now, when researching this history, I was surprised to learn that my late uncle, Congressman George Crockett Jr., held a congressional hearing in 1989 on the Cuban-American relationship, and the conclusion was that the U.S. embargo against Cuba wasn't working, and that restoring normal relations with Cuba was in our national economic and strategic interests. Visiting Havana in November 2023, 34 years after the U.S. Congress recommended a change in policy towards Cuba, I would say that the embargo is still not working. And that it is even more imperative now for both sides to put aside their past hostilities and mistrust to move forward to a new future. Now, I was only in Cuba for a very short time, but here are my observations, and you're welcome to disagree with them. I found the Cuban people to be friendly, welcoming, and surprisingly resilient. The average wage in Cuba appears to be less than $25 US per month, and Cuba's reliance upon imports for food and manufactured items means that the Cuban people are under extreme economic stress. Now, the government does supply basic necessities at rock-bottom prices. Walking around the city, you'll see people waiting with their ration books, called libretas, to pick up household items. Unfortunately, these rations are insufficient. For example, the current allocation for eggs is 5 per month. The city of Havana is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you will find some absolutely beautiful buildings and architecture. However, due to the economic situation, there is a severe lack of maintenance and repair. In fact, a number of the buildings are unsafe. For example, here we were told that 5 people died just several months ago when this building collapsed. Municipal services are notoriously unreliable. To ensure a constant supply of water, this building relies on an elaborate setup of storage tanks and an underground cistern. Havana also has a severe shortage of public buses, meaning that many hours are wasted each week waiting for transportation. This leads to the issue of the classic cars so often talked about cruising around Havana. Basically what they are is they're a Frankenstein vehicle. They're an older style chassis where a German diesel or Japanese diesel engine has been installed, and they've cobbled together through some ingenious method a transmission and all the parts needed to keep these vehicles operating. Pharmacies and hospitals lack the purchasing power to obtain even the most basic medicines and supplies, meaning that ordinary Cubans who can afford it are forced to rely on informal networks for the medicines they require. On the bright side, the Cuban government has relaxed the laws to encourage small businesses. So you'll notice many small shops are opening up, or you'll see restaurants with delicious food. However, with the high prevalence of imported goods and materials, many of these shops are unaffordable for average Cubans. While there's way too much happening in Cuba to discuss in this simple video, I did learn a few things about the history of the Cuban-American relationship. One of the major purposes of the embargo was to force Cuba to pay American companies for their losses in Cuba. Now, I don't believe that American companies ever lost any money in Cuba. They've never had to prove their damages in a court of law. And Cuba has never been given the opportunity to respond with their counterclaims of years of abuse and mistreatment. Regarding the explosion of the battleship Maine that enraged the American public and led to the Spanish-American War, modern research by the United States Navy conclusively established that the explosion was not due to a Spanish mine. Spontaneous combustion of bituminous coal was a problem that plagued many early naval warships and most likely caused the explosion on the Maine. On the edge of central Havana, there sits a monument to the battleship Maine, and it contains the names of 266 American sailors who lost their lives in service to the United States. The monument is in need of conservation and repair, and to do so would be an important first step for the United States and Cuba. You see, the monument actually has two sides, and in the side facing Cuba contains our promise to the Cuban people and is easy to read. However, the side facing America is a message we are prohibited from reading.